In uncertain times. How to be productive, little by little. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. Frederick Douglass. In July 2020, the Children's Commissioner for England and Longfield announced that over 120,000 teenagers in England were at risk of falling off the radar. This statistic was shocking, and at first glance one may attribute it to the adverse effects of the pandemic and the chaotic system of schooling as a result. But this statistic does not stand alone in 2020. In fact, the numbers over the past few years have been very similar and just as startling. For the school year 2017-18, the Commissioner's report found that 123,000 children had become invisible to support services. What happens when our youth becomes invisible? What happens when they fall through the massive cracks that are widening every year in our academic institutions and social services? They become a statistic either of crime, poverty, gang initiation, teen pregnancy, or tragically in some cases suicide. By the time they turn invisible as the Commissioner so perfectly describes it, then the worst has already happened and we have already failed them. The important work comes in the months and years before this happens. We have to catch them while they are still visible, long before they fall through the cracks. We have to catch them when they are at risk of derailment and make sure that the work is done in those early days. What is derailment? So what do we mean when we talk about derailment? In general terms, we are all at risk of becoming derailed at certain times in our lives. Think of any particular tragic or upsetting event that has happened in your own life, and notice the effects that had on your progress over the months following the event. Even as adults, we can experience setbacks that can derail us for weeks, months, and even years. Usually, we get back on our feet by committing to healthier routines, building a support network, and implementing changes to our lives. The effects of a derailment, therefore, can be minimized by our power and our responsibility to be able to make the necessary changes at the right time. But what if we were not aware of the derailment happening? What if we had been conditioned over years to believe that the lifestyle choices we were making were the only ones available to us? Well, then it would be harder for us to reverse that damaging programming and make substantial positive changes in our lives. That is what we need to consider when dealing with derailment in teenagers and children. They may not have any reference point with which to be able to spot the signs or the impact of derailment. For that reason, the adults and support services that interact with these at-risk teenagers have to be even more aware of the signs and symptoms of derailment, so that help can be provided much earlier. The impact of derailment on a child or a teenager as opposed to an adult is usually much more impactful and potentially catastrophic. Teenagers don't have the same agency over their own decisions or their own lives as adults do. So when we find young people at risk of derailment, there is the very real possibility that it is a result of factors that they have no control over. Environmental factors such as a poor home environment, or growing up with continued exposure to crime and violence, can have devastating effects on development and will certainly contribute to being at risk of derailment. When considering the overall risk of derailment, it is important to undertake a full assessment of the current circumstances of a young person in all areas of their lives. Excellence or at least progress in one area can sometimes mask underlying problems for a period of time, and so then when the dominoes start to fall, it can trigger a very fast and unexpected process. That is why it is so important to consider factors like the home environment, their social structures, support networks, and also any damaging online or offline activities that they are regularly engaged in. Usually, multiple factors combine over a lengthy period of time. By the time they reach their teenage years, these adolescents have been exposed to years of potentially damaging or limiting information. That is why it is so important to work with them in their teenage years to build in a strong foundational framework that will allow them to override any programming that might not be beneficial to them. The key part of this process is to spot the signs of derailment as early as possible, to increase the chances of being able to reverse the downward spiral.